This is the world-famous La Boca of Buenos Aires, where in 1991 a nightmare returned after nearly a century. Cholera, a disease many thought belonged to history books, exposed the complete failure of this city's water system. Only 70% of residents had clean water access, and barely half were connected to poor sewage. But what happened next is probably not the simple story you've heard. Yes, this is about privatization, and yes, that privatization failed, but focusing on that misses the most fascinating part of Buenos Aires' transformation into one of Latin America's water success stories.
Let's explore that.
The 1991 cholera outbreak didn't start in Buenos Aires. It began in Peru in January, marking cholera's first appearance in the Americas in nearly a century. By spring, it had reached northern Argentina and specifically the Salta province. The government initially claimed the Andes would protect Argentina, but they were wrong. The disease moved south along river systems, particularly the Pilcomayo and Bermejo rivers, which I probably pronounced wrong, and by autumn, cases appeared in Buenos Aires' vulnerable neighborhoods, particularly La Boca and Barranquilla. Now, these were not random locations, they were areas where only 58% of residents had sewage connections. What made this outbreak particularly shocking was Argentina's history. Unlike many Latin American countries, Argentina had effectively eliminated cholera in the early 1900s through massive water infrastructure investments. But the 1991 outbreak exposed how far that infrastructure had deteriorated. The response was chaotic. Hospitals were overrun not just by actual cases, but by thousands of worried residents with any stomach illness. The government distributed chlorine tablets and launched emergency infrastructure repairs, but the real story was what the crisis revealed. By 1991, Buenos Aires water infrastructure hadn't seen meaningful investments since the 1940s. OSN was caught in what water experts would call a death spiral. Low tariffs meant no maintenance, deteriorating service meant no public trust, and no trust meant no support for necessary rate increases. The numbers were staggering. Network pressure was so low that contamination was constant, service interruptions were normal, customer complaints took weeks or months to address, and the utility was losing $40 million monthly. In a city that had doubled its size since World War II, millions relied on unsafe wells or informal connections. This wasn't just a funding problem, it was an institutional collapse. There was no systematic mapping of underground infrastructure, no preventive maintenance programs, no modern laboratory equipment for water quality monitoring. When pipes burst, workers relied on memory and paper maps to find them. The privatization wasn't just about cholera, it was part of President Menem's larger privatization wave, and thus probably heavily discussed in the building just behind me. But water was different. Even pro-market officials were nervous about privatizing something as essential as water. But the numbers made the decision. The bidding process revealed the scale of the challenge. Any private operator would need to invest more than $4 billion just to modernize basic infrastructure. OSN was losing $40 million monthly, and water pressure was so low in many areas that contamination was constant. Now, nevertheless, there was significant opposition, particularly from utility unions who'd seen other privatizations lead to massive layoffs. The bidding process in itself was fascinating. While multiple international consortiums initially showed interest, the real race came down to two: Suez-led Aguas Argentinas and a consortium led by Thames Water. Suez won by promising more aggressive infrastructure expansion and slower tariff increases. But here's what's sometimes overlooked. The contract was incredibly detailed about technical improvements, not just coverage expansion. It mandated specific water quality standards, pressure requirements, and customer service metrics that OSN had never achieved. The early years were seen as a model privatization. The World Bank used Buenos Aires as a case study. Coverage expanded faster than required, water quality metrics improved dramatically, and even the union's fears proved partially unfounded. While the workforce was reduced, most cuts came through early retirement programs. By 1998, independent audits showed remarkable progress: 1.5 million new residents connected to water, pressure issues resolved in 80% of the network, and the first ever comprehensive map of underground infrastructure. And customer complaint response time had been reduced from weeks to days. That's how international delegations regularly visited to study the Buenos Aires miracle. But underneath this success, pressure was building. To understand what happened next, we need to understand Argentina's unique economic experiment. Since 1991, the country had maintained an artificial one-to-one peg between the peso and the US dollar. This convertibility plan had ended hyperinflation, but created other problems. By 1998, Argentina entered a recession. Tax revenues fell, public debt soared, and the fixed exchange rate meant Argentina could not devalue its currency to boost exports. And that's how by 2001 the system collapsed. For Aguas Argentinas, this was catastrophic. They had borrowed in dollars to fund infrastructure investments, and they were expected to repay through peso revenue. So when the peso fell to nearly 4-1 against the dollar, their debt effectively quadrupled while their revenue stayed flat in peso terms. Moreover, the government froze utility tariffs to protect consumers during the crisis. So Aguas Argentinas was caught in an impossible situation, unable to raise rates, watching debt costs soar, yet still legally required to meet investment targets. The end came gradually, then suddenly. First, Suez stopped most investments beyond essential maintenance, which led the government to respond by fining the company for missing targets. Suez argued force majeure due to the economic crisis, but local authorities countered that basic service couldn't be held hostage to financial disputes. By 2005, just 12 years into a 30-year concession, Suez wanted out. They proposed selling their stake to local investors. The government, now under President Kirchner but still in the same building, saw an opportunity. Rather than find a new private operator, they would create something new, a hybrid that would preserve the technical advances while changing the financial structure. What's, in my humble opinion, often overlooked is how the exit was handled. Unlike many utility nationalizations, there was a focus on preserving operational capabilities. In a sense, it was not an erasure of the private sector era, it was an evolution. The creation of AISA in 2006 was deliberately different from both OSN and Aguas Argentinas. But here's what's funny: while politicians proclaimed a return to public control, they quietly kept much of the private sector playbook. The new company structure was telling, with 90% that's owned by the government and 10% by worker shares, which is a model which was borrowed from European utilities. The board includes independent directors with private sector experience, and even more interesting, many senior Aguas Argentinas managers were retained. The transition itself was remarkably smooth, which is unusual for such a politically charged situation. But it's actually pretty self-explanatory because, unlike typical nationalizations, the goal was not to dismantle the previous system, but to preserve its technical advances while changing the financial model. That's how critical private sector practices were maintained, with performance-based management, international quality certifications, modern accounting standards, technical partnership with global leaders, and professional development programs. Today's AISA presents a fascinating contradiction. Publicly, the company's origin story often starts in 2006 with the Suez period described as a cautionary tale. But if you look at their facilities, you see a very different story. The GIS system mapping underground infrastructure still runs on the foundation built in the 90s. The SCADA network controlling water pressure and quality expanded, but is based on the original Suez-era architecture. Even the customer service protocols follow manuals first written during privatization. More tellingly, AISA maintains strong relationships with private sector partners, including Suez itself, now through technical service contracts. The company regularly sends staff for training at private utilities worldwide, and they've kept the practice of external technical audits, a private sector standard that OSN never had. This creates a quite cool dynamic. AISA operates more like a European mixed ownership utility than a traditional Latin American public water company. They maintain commercial practices while leveraging public funding for social goals. Sure, challenges remain, especially in informal settlements. Climate change poses new threats, but the utilities hybrid model with a public ownership and a private sector DNA provides a framework for addressing them. So you see, the real story of Buenos Aires water is not about public versus private. It's about how crises enabled permanent modernization. To that extent, I believe it echoes what I discussed in my book club episode on Barton Thompson's liquid assets. The link should be somewhere here. For water sector professionals, this suggests something profound. The debate should not be about ownership, but about how to create utilities that can maintain modern practices across political and economic cycles. If we look at the numbers, the legacy is visible. We have 90% water coverage, up from 70% in 1993, 80% sewage coverage, which is up from 58%, modern water quality monitoring, professional management systems, and sustainable technical partnerships. In Buenos Aires, a crisis, the cholera outbreak, created political will for change, which now echoes another book club episode with the dynamics of water innovation and its formal proof that crisis doubles the speed of technology adoption. Each crisis reshaped the utility, but the core improvements
remained.
For investors, operators, and policymakers worldwide, that might be the most valuable lesson. Success in water requires moving beyond simplistic public versus private debates to focus on creating resilient, professionally run utilities that can deliver consistent service across generations.
Now, with climate change, crises like too much or too few water are here to stay, which might be the right point in time to watch that story I brought back from Australia on how Melbourne handled the Millennium Drought. So click here to learn about their 20 billion unused desalination plant. Don't forget to subscribe if you like this kind of water stories, and I'll see you next time, and hopefully with a better haircut.